Honored and excited to have our next guest join us. Alexander Vindman is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. He received a Purple Heart while fighting in Iraq in 2004. His testimony was very prominent in the first impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. Alexander Vindman, thank you so very much for joining us this morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Jane. Always good to be on with the Wisconsin community. Last trip out was a little while ago, so I'm overdue for a trip out to the greater Milwaukee area.
Hey, come let us know when you're coming. We'll take you out for a night on the town. Absolutely. Alexander, for people who are not familiar with your story, You you were born in Ukraine when it was still part of the Soviet Union. Your family emigrated to the US. You joined the military very early. As I mentioned, you achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel in the US Army. You're a Purple Heart recipient. You fought on behalf of our country and then served on the National Security Council under former President Donald Trump. And when I was reading up on you and in preparation for this, I noticed that your first inkling that something wasn't exactly right was at an earlier meeting with Rick Perry, who was the Secretary of Energy at the time, and also an ambassador, the gentleman who owned all those hotels. And there was an ask that came up before the call to Vladimir Zelensky. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure, sure. I came to the U.S. first of all when I was 3.5 years old, and kind of so basically just about not quite born, but certainly raised, and then joined at 22, military career that lasted 20 years, rising to serving on the White House as the National Security Council. So pretty awesome run that ended it relatively abruptly when I reported Donald Trump's corruption, resulting in the first impeachment, targeted retaliation. So he stole my promotion to colonel and so forth. But that all started really late, very, very late in my career, a year into my stint on the National Security Council, when we were facing the 2020 election and Donald Trump wanted to tip the scales in his favor. So like a gangster, he looked for any and all means, including extortion, to try to advance his scheme. And I saw this scheme kind of unfold. The famous call occurred on July 25th, but I saw the scheme unfold over the course of months before that. The first thing was the ambassador, career public servant, just like myself, that was assigned to Ukraine, was fired in the late March, early April timeframe. And we started seeing this whole scheme unfold, and um, characters like Rudy Giuliani emerge as key perpetrators. Don Jr., actually, Donald Trump's son, was the critical factor in getting Masha Yovanovitch fired because he tweeted about her being a bad actor when she had nothing but U.S. national security interest in play. By the time we get to this call that you're referring to, I want to say it was July 10th, 2019. It was really, really quite well developed. The U.S. had held up about $400 million in security assistance to Ukraine while Ukraine was fighting Russia. The war started years before in 2014, and Donald Trump put the squeeze on Ukraine to be able to get them to deliver this investigation. And in this meeting that you're referring to, Gordon Sondland, a political appointee selected by Donald Trump, said, "Hey, this is what Ukrainians need to deliver in order to get the money, in order to get this meeting." And he did this to the Ukrainian National Security Advisor in this meeting. So that was the first time I basically went on the record. I said, we're not going to be party to this. I was arguing with this ambassador that we're not going to engage in this scheme that goes against U.S. national security interests.
Did he genuinely believe that that was an okay thing to do? Did this ambassador actually think that this is how business is done? This is how countries uh, conduct diplomacy, or did you think he knew that this was wrong? Because
Uh,
from what I
yeah,
from what I read, it was John Bolton was there, and he
yeah.
once the ambassador said that, John Bolton is like, "Yep, this meeting's over."
Yeah. So I would say that this was a bit of a cowboy operation. I would actually, strangely enough, say that the ambassador thought that he was doing the right thing and was willing to take any means to do it. He was actually a big supporter of Ukraine, and he thought that delivering this investigation would get Trump to lift this restriction on money that Congress had directed to Ukraine. But he was also one of those politically appointed, not professional career public servants that wasn't steeped in normal diplomatic affairs and how things are supposed to work, and was actually probably morally flexible because this was a Trump appointed ambassador. So they take on the character, folks that he selects in that political class take on his characteristics, have his, view of the world. And this guy was willing to do that, was willing to advance the scheme because he was directed by the chief of staff of the president of the United States to do this in order to move the relationship along the way Trump wanted it. So corruption was kind of permeating all of the White House and much of the government, at least at that political level, based on Donald Trump.
If you're just joining us, Alexander Vindman is our guest. He's a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. He's a Purple Heart recipient. He was a prominent witness in the first impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, when Donald Trump essentially called Alexander Vindman and said, yes, we'll give you the aid that's already been approved for you to get, but you need to start an investigation into Joe Biden's son before the election so they could try and stir up some dirt on that. Is that accurate?
That's quite accurate. So at this point, you have to remember that Biden announced his candidacy for the 2020 election sometime in May timeframe. Before that, the Trump campaign team was looking for any ways they could tip the election in their favor. In the early days, Biden looked quite weak. He really didn't hit a stride until the next year in the South Carolina primaries. He looked vulnerable. And what Donald Trump kind of sussed out with his team is that if they just the Ukrainians announce an investigation into Biden, that could derail the whole election and really tip 2020 in his favor. And he had his team of Rudy Giuliani, Trump Jr., these characters that had ties to Ukraine. Some of them have now been rehabilitated, like Lev Parnas play a critical role, and cooked up this scheme that people should understand had nothing to do with U.S. national security. It had nothing to do with investigating, legitimate wrongdoing, corruption that would occur in official channels. He would have done this by having the Department of Justice reach out to the Ukrainians, and launch pursue a legitimate investigation. This was all about tainting Biden with any means possible, any means necessary, and Trump carried that through. Not just that first impeachment, but he obviously tried to steal the election in with the insurrection on January 6, 2021, and he continues to cast a shadow over the way our elections are conducted today. So he's an old dog that doesn't know new tricks. It's the same thing he was doing back then carries through to today.
I mean, he still brings the laptop up to this day, and other of his close best
Yeah.
people. It sort of goes along with the first part of the discussion. When they come to you and say something that from your point of view, your training, what you know is protocol, when they say we want you to do an investigation, is it just as simple? No, I can't do that. I won't do that. You need to do this and this if you'd like that, but I will certainly not do it. Or is it like a I would feel dumbfounded by that request, but
Mm.
you have far more training than I do, so I
Yeah.
just imagine you were like, no, I will not.
So my career was kind of steeped in the history, the national security of our relationship with the entire region. I was actually responsible for writing the strategy for Russia for the Pentagon. That's why I made it over to the White House. They wanted me to work, how do we contend with Russia as an adversary? So I knew this was very, very far afield from what the rest of the government had put together, that the president actually had signed on with his national security strategy, that we were supposed to be meeting the challenge of Russia as increasingly aggressive. So when the scheme cooked up, it was not even remotely aligned with anything that the government had been doing to that point. That everybody up and down the chain of professionals, from the national security to the Department of Defense to the Secretary of State, it was so far afield that you know my reaction was visceral. I was like, we will not be a party to this. And then I proceeded to report that scheme to the oversight bodies in the White House in classified channels. Was these attorneys that had that role, and said that this is not something that we're going to be a party to. And they kept moving on in their own direction. Actually, that first report in July didn't stop them. That second report, July 25th, didn't stop them. It really carried all the way through September until the House started their investigation. They started their impeachment inquiry. That's what got them.
We're going to
So,
continue our conversation with Alexander Vindman, retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army and a major witness in Donald Trump's first impeachment trial. Stay close. You are listening to Matenaer on Air. This is the Civic Media Radio Network. Good morning and welcome back to Matenaer on Air. Jane Matenaer, Greg Bach, Calvin B. on the board, coming to you from our studio in downtown Waukesha. You can join us, call, text. Same number, 855-752-4842. Leave a comment if you're watching on the live stream on Facebook, YouTube, and what used to be Twitter. Honored to have our next guest still with us for another segment. Alexander Vindman is a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel, a Purple Heart recipient he received while fighting in Iraq, and of course played a prominent role in the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump, when Trump essentially tried to lean on the Ukrainian government to manufacture an investigation into the Bidens to give him an edge heading into the 2020 election. Alexander, let's talk about Donald Trump's claims that he's going to call Vladimir Putin even before he's inaugurated, should he get reelected, and the war is just going to end.
yeah. Well, it turns out that he's had 7 calls with Vladimir Putin, as reported by Bob Woodward. And those calls started before the war started. So either Donald Trump was complicit in knowing that war was coming and didn't prevent it then, and has had no effect on the war starting in February 2022, or moderating the horrific, barbaric attacks on civilians that Putin's been conducting for the entirety of the 2.5 years. So it's really kind of comical at this point for Trump to get any consideration for being able to end this war, because he had 4 years of war when he was in office, from 2016 to 2020. There was already a hot war, and certainly Trump was sending signals to Putin that this was okay. A larger war, a full-scale war, was okay, and that Putin could feel encouraged in launching this war, because there would be no consequences, because Trump would always be in his corner no matter what. Those 7 calls kind of illustrate that. So it is absolutely absurd to think that the right person to manage a very, very dangerous conflict between Russia and Ukraine in Europe is Donald Trump. He's mismanaged it when he was in office. He's incited full-scale war afterwards. He's just lying about this. And if anything, he would be far more dangerous, because he's chaos, because he's not respected. He is somebody that's likely to encourage Putin to be increasingly aggressive. And this is the recipe for spillover. We do not need chaos. We need stability. We need dependability. We need a steady hand. We need somebody that's respected. Kamala Harris has that. And Trump does not. Trump is chaos and recipe for disaster.
And he's a Putin fanboy. We played a clip yesterday from the former Prime Minister of Australia, who essentially said, when we would be in meetings and Donald Trump would meet Vladimir Putin, it was like a 12-year-old meeting the star football player on the high school team. That's not a healthy, that would not be good for any of us.
Look, I need to somehow underscore that people shouldn't believe the nice sounding line that Trump could end this war. He can't. The Russians would not would disregard him. The Ukrainians would fight on because it's their country. They're just not going to let it go. The Europeans have been there in a bigger way than the US. Actually, they put in probably almost twice as much as we have in supporting Ukraine. They're not going to go away just because the US backs off. But without the US as the linchpin, the backbone of NATO, Putin would be more adventurous. He would likely test the idea that NATO actually is viable. And this is a recipe for a larger war. And we know what large wars in Europe mean. We've been in two of those situations. Those are wars that drag us in. Trump would be the factor that catalyzes, that precipitates it. Whereas Harris, you could kind of nitpick and think that she's not been exactly where she needs to be. Maybe we've been a little bit slow in our support to Ukraine, but the comparison between the two is just it couldn't be more stark. Harris is what's going to keep us out of a large war. Trump is what's going to be what drags us into a larger war.
We've only got about 3 minutes left. I want to talk about Schedule F and Project 2025 and what a second Trump term would look like. Alexander Vindman is our guest, retired lieutenant colonel with the U.S. Army. Sorry about that, and a Purple Heart recipient. Um, Alexander, you'd mentioned Gordon Sondland, who was the ambassador to Ukraine at the time, and that he was a political hire. It was a friendly hire. He had no experience in this. Project 2025 would do nothing but fill up the government with a whole bunch of people who have nothing except loyalty to Donald Trump.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that you always have political hires. The president comes in, he's entitled to put in political hires in that political layer. What Schedule F does is it takes the professional class, a civil servant class. We're talking about 50, 60,000 career decades of service, whether it's the military, Department of Defense, State Department, all of the different government agencies. It would convert all those positions, not just that thin layer at the top of several thousand, but 60,000 into political people that he could fire and put in with loyalists. The only test would be whether they're politically loyal. It is disastrous. So this is actually a very, very close issue for my twin brother, who's the Democratic nominee for Virginia 7, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., with all of those public servants, retirees. It is extremely dangerous. Think about, I live in Florida now. The entities that cover weather effects, the EPA for environmental issues, everything would kind of be on the Department of Education would be on the chopping block as institutions under Project 2025, and then Schedule F would take what remains and convert those at the senior level to political positions. So it'd be very, very dangerous.
It is taking your least qualified, least accomplished cousin and putting them in a management position for which they have no qualifications. That's the way I look at it.
One qualification: loyalty, absolute blind loyalty to Donald Trump. So no checks and balances. So it's more dangerous than that cousin because he would be in a position of authority and he would be very, very loyal to Donald Trump.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. Thank you for your service to our country. We had a number of commenters on the live stream. Thank you so very much. Alexander Vindman, retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. Really appreciate your time. News is coming up next. Stay with us.
Thank you.
You're listening to Matenaer on air on the Civic Media Radio Network.